Okay, Chapter 9, Suicide. I want to be careful and thoughtful how I present this material. I know I made you guys listen to me getting on my soapbox last time when we were talking about depression, but this is another one that um, I want to be cognizant of the fact that there are folks, maybe folks in our class, who either are or have struggled with suicidal thoughts and intentions. And we're going to talk about it in terms of the research, but I don't want us to lose sight of the human aspect of this, where I really feel very strongly that if, once again, as I was talking about with depression, feeling like you want your life to end is not how most folks spend most of their time. Um, and if that's you, then I would strongly, strongly encourage you to talk to somebody about that, um, because the one sure thing in this world is that things do change. And situations that seem unbearable, seem impossible to escape, stick with it long enough and things do change. The only thing that will ensure that nothing changes is ending a life. So, once again, I'm not a therapist, but I would be happy, more than happy, to sit and listen and talk to anybody who's struggling, and I'll try and help you find the resources that you need. And as I start this, I will do my best to be careful and sensitive in how I talk about things. Um, if I fail, please forgive me and please let me know, because I would like to know that so that I can do better in the future. Okay. All right. So we've got roughly 1 million people a year across the world, 42,000 here in the United States. That commit suicide every year. This is not classified in and of itself as a mental health disorder, although suicidal behavior has been proposed to be included in the next revision of the DSM, but there are lots of proposals, so it'll be interesting to see whether or not that ends up in the DSM, given the potential for harm, disruption, dysfunction, danger. It seems likely that at some point that will make its way into the DSM. Now, when we're talking about suicide, hopefully everybody has a clear idea of what we're talking about. This is an intentional, conscious effort to end one's own life. One of our premier theorists here is a guy named Schneidman, who has termed himself a suicidologist, and came up with a lot of the terminology that we use in psychology. He defined 4 different groups of suicidal folks. You have the death seekers, those who are actively seeking their own death and likely to carry out suicide attempts using lethal means. These are folks who are more likely to use guns or other methods of killing themselves that are likely to succeed. They are seeking death. That is their goal, right? The death initiator is someone who sees themselves as simply speeding up a process that is already occurring, whether that is simply someone who is viewing life as ending every day. And I mean, that is one way you can look at life, right? Every day you're one day closer to dying. And even as we are growing, we are moving closer to death. More commonly, death initiators are those who have found that they have terminal illnesses or degenerative diseases and view themselves as simply shortening the time span that they have to suffer, right? There's a lot of those folks. Death ignorers are those who view death as a transition rather than an end, right? So they believe that they will continue in some form, whether that's as the soul or in another life or in reincarnation or one way or the other, that ending their own life will not end their existence, and so therefore is okay, right? And then death darers are interesting ones. They seem to be more ambivalent about the idea of killing themselves, and so will engage in behaviors that could be lethal, but may not necessarily end their life, whether that's dangerous driving or extreme risk-taking or thrill-seeking behavior, but things where they absolutely could die. And when there are patterns of that kind of behavior, then you're dealing with a death darer. Okay. We also do talk about what they term sub-intentional death, where there are self-harming behaviors that are intended to be non-lethal, but could easily, with a small mistake, end up being lethal. So cutting behavior is what you call sub-intentional death behavior. And there are more extreme versions of this even than cutting, where people will, cut off bits of themselves and things like that. Pretty severe cases, these. Now, generally speaking, when we're studying suicide, it's a hard thing to study because there is such a social stigma around suicide. Generally speaking, if someone has attempted suicide or is thinking about suicide, they either aren't telling anybody, or if the attempt has already occurred, their family doesn't want them talking to anybody about it so that they can, get over it, put it behind them, whatever the case may be. That has loosened up some over the last few decades as we've changed our ideas about what suicide means and how we're supposed to treat folks with mental illnesses and disorders. And so you get two different avenues of study. You've got retrospective studies of those who have committed suicide, where you go and interview friends and family and comb through their notes and letters and whatever else that they've left behind in order to understand personality traits and intentions and whatnot. And then a more fruitful source frequently is to study those who have enacted suicide attempts but survived. As I said, while that has been taboo in past days, more and more folks are opening up to the idea that it might be useful to study these things and know a little bit more about what's going on. And so you get folks who will report on their experiences and undergo psychological testing and brain scans and whatnot after a suicide attempt. And that gives us a lot of information about how people are thinking, how they're feeling, and what they're doing. Now, while that's an advancement, it's one step forward and two steps back, it feels like sometimes, as you go on the internet and look at some of the messaging that exists that encourages people to end their own lives. Now, a lot of this is simply trolling, right? Where, I don't know if you've ever had the misfortune to go into the darker corners of Reddit or 4chan or 8chan or any of those unpleasant spots. But you'll regularly get folks encouraging individuals who post saying that they're depressed, encouraging them to kill themselves and providing information about how it could be done successfully and quickly, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, a lot of these folks are young, sort of cognitively immature folks who are just thinking they're funny. Then you get some small core of older individuals who know what they're doing and seeking to harm others and get people off the planet, apparently, which I don't understand in the slightest. But this information reaches nearly 10% of teenagers here in the United States, and so that's nothing to sneer at. It's a big deal. Also, the difficulty that we'll maybe talk about a little bit later in terms of the effects that this has is the live streaming of people completing their own suicides. This can have real negative effects, not just on anybody who views it. I sure wouldn't want to see something like that. But especially on those who are struggling with suicidal ideation themselves. Now, if you haven't heard that term before, it's just suicidal thinking, right? Thinking about suicide, planning suicide, et cetera, et cetera. If you're in that boat and you see somebody else successfully carry it out, and there's dozens or hundreds of people watching them, that can be an encouragement of a sort to do the same thing yourself. And we do frequently see cluster suicides, where you get somebody who successfully commits suicide, especially if they are well-known, a celebrity of some sort, or whether they are in the friend group of somebody who's struggling. You will frequently get an increase in the same type of suicide in the immediate area of the individual who carries that out. which, once again, not helping anybody in terms of fixing things. When you look at who is committing suicide and how much, males complete suicides far more frequently than females do, something on the order of 4 times as often, uh, on the whole. Not because they're actually attempting suicide more. In fact, you get twice as many suicide attempts from females as you do from males, but women tend to use less lethal means. Men are more likely to shoot themselves or hang themselves, and women are more likely to take overdose on pills or cut their wrists, both of which take longer and therefore leave more room for intervention and to actually save the person's life. But as you can see here, the rates vary by ethnicity, they vary by country, they vary by gender, they vary by socioeconomic background. Unsurprisingly, those who are in the lowest echelons of our of wealth tend to be more likely to commit suicide than those who are wealthier. Interestingly, there are some religious factors that are correlated as well. People who score highly on religious devoutness, meaning they have a very deep belief in God and in the reality of another life, tend to be slightly more likely to commit suicide than those who are not. Once again, that goes back to the death ignorers, right? If you think that you're going to go somewhere after this, especially as is the general Christian paradigm that you are likely to go to a place that is better than this after you die, then somebody who is struggling with this life may say, well, screw it, I'm moving on to the next one, right? Now, these are the best numbers that we have got. That being said, we do have to recognize that there is likely significant underreporting in large parts of the population. Okay, in terms of what makes suicide more likely to occur, what brings it on, what triggers this, you've got these 5 that we'll go over one by one. Stressful events, changes in mood and thought, drug use, mental health, and then modeling, which I've already mentioned some. So let's go through these one by one. Stressful events. We talk about how stress is a load on our backs. We call it the allostatic load. Our stressors are not independent from each other. The emotional experience of our stress is cumulative, right? You don't, so let's say you have an argument with your roommate in the morning. Somebody didn't do the dishes, right? And then you go to work and you get yelled at by your supervisor. Those two things stack on top of each other emotionally and cognitively. Even though they happen in separate domains of your life and those two people will never meet or interact, still those things weigh together on your shoulders like you're carrying a backpack full of rocks, right? And so the more stressors a person experiences in the short term, unsurprisingly, the higher the risk of suicide, especially when you're dealing with serious stressors in the short term, like the death of a loved one, or going through a divorce, or losing a job, or living through a natural disaster. These things all make suicide slightly more likely in the general population. Now, the rates are still fairly low, even after something terrible like Hurricane Katrina, but they are going to be significantly higher than they were before. That is going to include long-term stressors as well. They may not necessarily drive somebody to the brink as quickly, but can do so just as surely. If you are suffering from social isolation over long periods of time, or have a serious illness that won't go away, or you're in an abusive environment, or you are under heavy loads of stress all of the time at work, these are things that can wear a person down and make even those of us who are not necessarily prone to suicidality feel like sometimes life isn't worth it. So much more so for someone who is prone to that kind of thinking. Now, none of these are necessarily the answer as to why suicide happens. They all kind of work together, right? So you've got stressors and the impact that weighs a person down. This goes hand in hand with mood and thought changes. So one of the real frequent things that people report before a suicide attempt is that their thinking has changed, their mood has changed. They feel differently than they did before. Now, as you can imagine, having a suddenly higher level of stressors in your life would do this. Sometimes, though, this change, this shift in mood and thinking can happen even if your stressors didn't suddenly get worse. Sometimes your mind just changes, right? And we don't even necessarily know exactly why all of the time. But when you experience an increase in hopelessness or sadness, um, Schneidman, the guy who I was talking about before, um, came up with the term psych ache, like a headache, but in the psyche or in the soul, right? So this is an unrelenting pain or sadness that just doesn't go away and deeply afflicts you. That he termed as one of the precursors to suicide. Um, Drug use broadly, but especially alcohol. 70% of people attempting suicide drink alcohol beforehand. Um, Although frequently that is merely something for the person to say, well, I'm going to loosen myself up so that I've got the courage to do this. Only about a fourth of people attempting suicide are actually intoxicated. Um, the impact of drug use, whether it's alcohol or something else, is going to be even larger for those in their teen years and early adulthood, up through about age 25 or so. As the brain is more reactive to those substances, you get a higher high or a deeper low, and you have less experience with exposure to those substances, and so the impact on your behavior and on your thinking can be larger. Mental health disorders, unsurprisingly, those who attempt suicide are much more likely to have a mental health disorder than those who do not. Roughly 70% of those who attempt suicide are suffering from some sort of unipolar depression, 20% some sort of alcoholism or substance abuse disorder, 10% schizophrenia, which is sort of a different thing, but makes it difficult to perceive what is reality and be on top of what is really going on around you. It can be very disorienting and unrelenting, right? So your suicide risk actually increases with comorbid disorders, which just means you have more than a single disorder at the same time. You've got quite a few comorbid disorders, meaning that you're more likely to have one if you have the other. So depressive disorders and anxiety disorders, for instance, are comorbid. You're likely to have both of them, or more likely to have the second if you have the first. And so if you have that second one, then that ups your suicide risk even further. PTSD, unsurprisingly, and other trauma disorders increase suicide risk, as does panic disorder and substance use disorder and borderline personality disorder. Okay, and so take a look over these predictors. I don't know if I'm necessarily going to test you on any of them, but knowing the signs that you should be looking for in others or even in yourself, what things make it more likely for someone to be at risk for suicide, can only be a good idea as you're dealing with the world around you.